The moment Sophie dropped the dusty old ledger on the church floor, she heard something shift beneath the altar. She never imagined that beneath the rotting pews and crumbling walls of the abandoned church, her inheritance would turn into the one thing that could change everything for her family. A secret buried in silence for decades. Before we dive into Sophie's jaw-dropping discovery, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Sophie Parker had always been the kind of woman who lived by a simple rule: work hard, take care of your kids, and never expect anything to come easy. It had been that way for years, ever since her ex-husband walked out, leaving her to raise their 2 children on her own. The days were long, the paycheck never seemed to stretch far enough, but Sophie kept going, for them. Her small apartment, barely big enough for all of them, had become a sanctuary of sorts. The flickering lights, the peeling wallpaper, the crowded living room where they huddled together. It was home, and it was all she needed. That was until the letter came. It was thick, official-looking, with a seal she didn't recognize. At first, Sophie thought it was another one of those notices about bills she couldn't pay or an error at the bank. But then she saw the name on the return address, Reverend John Parker. Her uncle, the one she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, the faint smell of musty paper filling the air. Sophie's heart skipped a beat when she saw the words, "You have inherited the property at 1289 East Ridgeway Road, St. Gabriel's Church." St. Gabriel's Church, she blinked, staring at the words as if they were a mistake. Her uncle, a reclusive preacher who had spent the last years of his life holed up in that decaying church, had left it to her? It made no sense. Sophie could barely remember the last time she'd heard from him, and when she did, it was always brief, cryptic, full of his talk about redemption, salvation, and the good of the Lord's work. She wasn't even sure if he had any family left, let alone if he considered her worthy of the inheritance. The letter went on to explain that the church was in disrepair, that the building was no longer in use, and that Sophie was now responsible for its upkeep. There was no explanation of how or why, no instruction on what she should do next. Just the cold, detached reality of ownership being thrust upon her. A church, a dilapidated, decaying church that hadn't seen a congregation in years, a church with rotting pews, broken windows, and peeling paint. Sophie shook her head, her stomach sinking. This wasn't a blessing, it was a burden. She looked at her kids, Jack and Emma, as they sat at the kitchen table, oblivious to the chaos now swirling in her mind. Jack, her 12-year-old son, was drawing something on the back of a school worksheet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Emma, her 8-year-old daughter, was playing with her doll, humming softly. They were happy. They were content. They didn't know the weight Sophie was carrying, the weight of a dead man's legacy. With a sigh, she tucked the letter into her purse. Her hands were already busy gathering her things, making sure the kids had their coats and lunches packed. As she grabbed the keys to her old beat-up car, a thought nagged at her. What was she supposed to do with this church? Sell it? Fix it? Burn it to the ground and start over? Sophie had no idea, but she knew one thing. She had to at least see it for herself. Maybe there was something she missed. Maybe it wasn't as bad as the letter made it seem. The drive to the church was long and silent. The car hummed as Sophie tried to push away the rising panic in her chest. The church was located on the outskirts of town, far from the places she normally went, a forgotten relic of a time when people still came together in buildings like that. She hadn't seen the place in years, but even from the distance, she could tell it hadn't aged well. The tall spire of the church towered in the distance, crooked and broken. The stone exterior, once proud and firm, was now crumbling. The large stained glass windows had long since been shattered, and the roof, sagging under years of neglect, looked like it might collapse at any moment. Sophie parked her car, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and sat for a moment staring at the building. It was so much worse than she had imagined. The tall iron gates were rusted shut, the parking lot overgrown with weeds. There was nothing about this place that screamed potential. It screamed burden, and Sophie felt the full weight of it pressing down on her chest. She sat there, looking at the ruins of a church that should have been a symbol of faith, not a broken-down nightmare. She wondered if she should have just ignored the letter, if she should have called the lawyer and told him she wanted nothing to do with it. But no, the inheritance was now hers, and no matter how much she wanted to turn back, there was no escaping it. Her kids, who had been playing in the back seat, began to ask questions. "Mom, is this our new home?" Jack asked, poking his head over the seat. "No, honey," Sophie replied, forcing a smile. This is just a building we have to take care of for a while." She didn't know what the future held for them, but she couldn't afford to think too much about it. Sophie had enough problems already. What was one more? As she got out of the car, the sound of the wind howling through the empty lot made her shiver. She grabbed her kids and walked toward the church's broken doors, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to stumble upon something she never expected, something that would change everything. Sophie pushed open the heavy, creaking doors of St. Gabriel's Church, and the musty, damp smell of mildew immediately hit her like a wall. It was like stepping into another time, a forgotten place where the air itself had grown stale, holding onto memories of prayers long past. Her children followed her inside, their small footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the building. Jack's voice broke the silence, a curious but cautious tone. "Mom, what is this place?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Instead, she stepped further into the church, her eyes scanning the space. The once grand structure seemed to sag under the weight of its own neglect. Sunlight filtered through the shattered stained glass windows, casting fractured, muted colors across the floor. The glass was cracked, pieces of it missing altogether, leaving jagged outlines of saints and angels that seemed to weep in the dim light. There had once been beauty here, vibrancy, life, but now it felt like a place that time had forgotten, left to rot in the shadows of a past no one wanted to remember. The pews, once polished wood, were now broken, with cracked seats and splintered edges. Some were overturned, others leaning against the walls, abandoned as if waiting for someone to care enough to fix them. The thick layer of dust that coated everything seemed to suffocate the space, making it hard to breathe. Sophie's eyes stung, a mixture of the dust and the sudden weight of the situation pressing in on her. She had expected this, of course, but seeing it up close felt like a punch to the gut. She looked down at her children, Jack and Emma, who were already exploring the aisles. Emma, always the curious one, was tracing her fingers along the old wood of a broken pew while Jack stood by the altar, looking up at the high, cracked ceiling. Sophie couldn't help but think that they didn't belong here, that they didn't deserve to be stuck in this forgotten ruin of a church. They deserved something better, something warmer, a place where they could grow, not be haunted by the ghosts of a man they barely knew. But this was her inheritance, her responsibility now, whether she liked it or not. Her heart ached as she thought of her uncle, the man she hadn't seen in years. He had always been a mystery to her, a preacher with more secrets than she ever cared to uncover. Sophie had long distanced herself from religion and the idea of faith. She didn't have time for it anymore, not with her life the way it was. With bills piling up, a crumbling apartment, and 2 kids to raise on her own, faith felt like something for other people, people who had time to wonder about the bigger picture. But now here she was, standing in the midst of a broken sanctuary, holding the keys to it all. Sophie looked up again, her gaze moving slowly from the altar to the crumbling walls, the remnants of what once might have been a place of peace and prayer. There was an old pulpit still standing at the front, though the wood had been worn down and faded with age. A large golden cross that had once gleamed proudly above the altar now seemed tarnished and faded, as if it too had been waiting for the world to stop turning. A shiver ran down Sophie's spine. For the briefest moment she wondered if her uncle had known this would happen, if he had left her this place as some sort of final message, a lesson in humility, or perhaps a test she wasn't meant to pass. She wiped a hand across her forehead, trying to shake off the nagging sense of obligation that was settling in her chest. But as she stood there, something about the place pulled at her, something deeper than just the weight of inheritance. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the broken glass, soft and gentle, like a memory trying to resurface. Or maybe it was the silence, thick and expectant, as if the church itself was waiting for her to breathe life back into it. Sophie hadn't planned on staying here for long, let alone fixing it up. It felt like a pipe dream, like a task too big for one person to handle. But still she felt it, this tiny pull at her heart, an inkling of something that said stay. Maybe, just maybe, she needed to see this through. For her uncle, for her kids, for something that had been lost. The weight of the decision pressed on her, but she couldn't ignore it. Perhaps it wasn't about fixing this church or even saving it. Maybe it was about honoring a man she barely knew, a man who had left her with this broken building, and somehow this strange feeling that this was her chance to make something out of nothing. She didn't know what it would be or how she would get there, but standing in the middle of the church, she realized that this wasn't just a building she had inherited. This was a crossroads, a moment where she could decide who she was going to be. Sophie took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the altar, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she approached, she placed a hand on the cold stone of the altar, feeling its age, its weight. She didn't have all the answers, but something told her she wasn't meant to walk away just yet. She was meant to stay and see what this place, this church, had left to give. Word of Sophie's unexpected inheritance spread through the small town quicker than she could have imagined. By the time she'd returned to the church after her first visit, whispers had already begun to circulate in the local coffee shops and grocery stores. Sophie hadn't realized just how much of an impact her estranged uncle's passing had on the town. To them, he wasn't just the old preacher in the decaying church. He was a part of their history, someone who had lived in the shadows, a mystery that no one seemed to fully understand. It was a Monday afternoon when Sophie first met Mary, the town's unofficial historian, who had a way of making every conversation feel like an interrogation. Sophie had taken the kids to the local diner for a quick lunch, desperate for some normalcy after a chaotic morning of trying to make sense of the church. As soon as she stepped inside, Mary, a woman in her late 60s with a cloud of white hair and glasses perched on the edge of her nose, took one look at Sophie and slid into the booth across from her without asking. "I hear you've got yourself a new project," Mary said, her eyes sharp, scanning Sophie's face as though trying to decide if she was a fool or just another lost soul. "That church? St. Gabriel's?" She didn't wait for Sophie to respond. "What a mess it's become. You sure you want to take that on?" Sophie had no answer at first, unsure if she was speaking to someone who truly cared or simply enjoyed the gossip. "I'm just looking into it. I haven't made any decisions yet." Mary raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Looking into it?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Honey, that place has been falling apart for years. Your uncle didn't even bother to fix the roof before he passed. No one's been inside for a service in a long time, and for good reason." Sophie shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't sure what to expect, but certainly not this harsh reception. She tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. "What about the church? I mean, does anyone around here have memories of it? Or of my uncle?" The question seemed to catch Mary off guard, but she recovered quickly, her voice taking on a more contemplative tone. "Oh, plenty of stories, honey. Some of them good, some of them, well, not so much. Your uncle wasn't exactly the man he claimed to be. He liked to play the part of the saintly preacher, but there were rumors." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You see, people around here used to say he had a little side business going. A lot of money changing hands, no one quite sure where it came from, and some of the locals were suspicious about where he was getting all that extra cash. She paused, her gaze darkening. Some say he wasn't just preaching. Some say he was hiding things in that church, things you might not want to know about. Sophie's stomach twisted as she processed Mary's words. She had always known her uncle had been an enigma, but the insinuations made her uneasy. What kind of man had he really been? She had inherited a church, yes, but it felt less like a gift and more like a burden wrapped in mystery. The more she heard, the more Sophie started to question whether her uncle had truly left her something worth salvaging, or if she had simply inherited a ghost story, a story she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Later that day, Sophie met Tim, the local handyman, who had stopped by the church to offer his help. He seemed kind enough, though there was a hesitancy in his voice as he explained that he had been the one to fix the broken windows years ago, before the church fell into complete disrepair. "I know the place, ma'am," he said, wiping his hands on his worn-out jeans. "I'd be happy to lend a hand if you decide to fix things up. Though, I'm not sure you should. A lot of folks think it's a lost cause." Sophie, grateful for the offer but still unsure, asked, "Why's that? What's the history behind the church? I'm trying to understand." Tim scratched his chin, clearly weighing his words. "Like I said, I know the church. Your uncle kept to himself, but he wasn't always the man people thought he was. He was a good preacher, sure, but there were rumors about what he was hiding in the back rooms. You know, the kind of stuff that didn't belong in a church." He paused, looking around the building as though searching for answers that were locked away in the peeling walls. "People around here, they think that place is cursed. Some say it's full of old sins that don't ever leave." Sophie felt a chill run through her. She didn't know whether Tim was just spinning a tale or if there was truth to what he was saying. But as she looked around the church again, the weight of its history pressed down on her. The building had once been filled with life, laughter, and faith. Now it stood as a hollow shell, its broken windows and decaying pews a silent testament to the years it had been abandoned. What had happened here? What had her uncle been involved in that had left this place so full of unanswered questions? As the days went on, Sophie met a few other locals, some kinder than others. A few offered help, mentioning how much they missed the church when it was still active, while others avoided her gaze, as if the very idea of someone trying to restore it was a mockery. They all seemed to have their own opinion of her uncle. Some spoke of his piety, others of his dark secrets, but none seemed to truly know the man, not in a way that would help Sophie understand what she'd inherited. Sophie found herself torn. The idea of leaving the church behind felt easier, but the thought of walking away from something her uncle had entrusted to her didn't sit well. She could sell it, move on with her life, and forget about the past. But as much as she tried to ignore it, something deep inside her resisted. There was a pull here, a strange connection to a man she barely knew, and a church that seemed to hold so many untold stories. Maybe it wasn't just about the building. Maybe it was about finding answers, not just about her uncle, but about what kind of person she was willing to become. Sophie didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. She was standing on the edge of a mystery, and there was no turning back now. The rain tapped against the broken windows of St. Gabriel's like a quiet reminder that time was slipping away. Sophie sat at the desk in the old office at the back of the church, sorting through piles of paperwork her uncle had left behind. The room smelled musty, like forgotten memories, and the light filtering through the shattered glass cast long shadows across the clutter. She felt a wave of frustration rise inside her. All these years, and this was the legacy her uncle had left her, a dilapidated building and a pile of unorganized files. She had expected a treasure chest of answers, but all she found were boxes of dust and neglect. As Sophie shifted through a stack of old papers, a heavy leather-bound book caught her eye. It sat slightly wedged between two wooden file cabinets, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. The edges were frayed, and the once glossy cover had dulled with age, but there was something about it that felt important. She pulled it from its hiding place, her fingers brushing against the brittle surface. The weight of it felt substantial, heavier than she anticipated, and she opened the book with caution. The pages were yellowed and cracked, fragile under her touch. Sophie hesitated for a moment, as if the ledger might contain more than she was ready to know. She began to flip through the pages slowly, feeling the grain of the paper under her fingers. Each page was filled with a neat, meticulous handwriting, a record of some sort, dates, numbers, names. But as she read on, her stomach began to twist. The entries didn't match anything she expected from a church. There were records of transactions, large sums of money, extravagant purchases, even the names of people she didn't recognize. It didn't take long for Sophie to realize that this ledger wasn't a record of donations or church expenses. No, it was something else entirely. One entry in particular caught her attention. It was dated 6 months before her uncle's death, and it listed a payment of $50,000 for something labeled Supply and Acquisition. The amount was staggering for a small-town church, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder what her uncle could have been buying with that kind of money. As she skimmed through more pages, the pattern became clear. Large payments, mysterious vendors, and no indication of what the money was for. She found an entry for a purchase of rare books from a private collector, followed by another for miscellaneous expenses that listed an astronomical sum with no explanation. Sophie's hands began to tremble as she turned the pages. The ledger went on for pages and pages, each one more confusing than the last. There were deposits of cash from names that seemed strangely familiar. Some of them she recognized from local news stories, others from rumors she'd heard in town. The amounts were staggering, the kind of money that shouldn't have been flowing through a small, run-down church. A pit began to form in Sophie's stomach as she wondered if her uncle's life had been hiding something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The names on the pages were all too carefully documented, but Sophie couldn't place them in any meaningful context. Was her uncle running some sort of underground operation, or worse, was the church serving as a front for something illegal? The thought made her skin crawl. How could she have been so blind? How could she have ignored the whispers that people had been sharing for years about her uncle's mysterious behavior, his odd visitors, and the rumors that never seemed to go away? Sophie had dismissed them, thinking they were just small-town gossip. But now, holding this ledger in her hands, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what was hidden here. She had inherited more than just a building. She had inherited a web of secrets, and it felt like they were starting to close in on her. She quickly flipped to the end of the ledger, praying there might be some sort of explanation, some final entry that would make it all make sense. But instead, she found one last transaction. It was a deposit, $100,000 in cash, dated the day before her uncle passed away. The name listed as the recipient was one she hadn't seen before, C.D. Montgomery. She stared at the name for a long time, trying to make sense of it, but nothing clicked. Sophie's thoughts were spinning, her heart racing. What had her uncle been involved in? Was it just coincidence? Or had he been caught up in something far beyond what she could have ever imagined? And the biggest question of all, had he known something was coming? The last deposit, made just a day before his death, felt like a dark omen. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this ledger was, it was only the beginning. The church, this place she had thought was just an old building filled with dust, was now a haunting monument to a life she hadn't known existed. Sophie closed the ledger with trembling hands, a cold sweat forming on her brow. She had inherited more than a crumbling church. She had inherited a mystery. And the more she dug, the more she realized she wasn't just uncovering her uncle's past. She was uncovering a dangerous web of secrets that someone, somewhere, was willing to protect. She didn't know what to do with the ledger, but she knew she couldn't let it go. It held the answers, the key to understanding what her uncle had really been involved in. And she was beginning to understand that those answers might not come without a price. The feeling wouldn't leave her. It was like a shadow, lurking just behind Sophie as she paced the worn floorboards of the church. Something about the altar seemed off. She couldn't explain it, but there was an energy about it, a heaviness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up every time she stepped closer. The church was full of secrets. She knew that now. She had seen the ledger, read the names and numbers that made her stomach churn. But there was something more, the altar, where everything was meant to be pure, to be sacred, felt like the heart of it all. And Sophie couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the answers, the real answers, were buried beneath it. She had considered the idea before, but each time she dismissed it. She wasn't a detective, and she wasn't the type of person who poked around in places she wasn't supposed to be. But now, after everything, Sophie couldn't ignore the pull. She had to know. She had to understand. The questions kept swirling in her mind, louder and louder, until they became the only sound she could hear. What had her uncle been hiding here? Was there more money, more records, or something else entirely? Sophie stood in front of the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The old weathered wood creaked beneath her weight as she knelt down and ran her fingers along the edges of the floorboards. There was a small gap between the altar and the flooring, just wide enough for a crowbar. She didn't have a crowbar, but she'd find one. Her mind was already made up. There was no turning back now. She was alone, the church silent, except for the faint sound of rain tapping against the broken windows. The light filtering in through the shattered glass cast fragmented patterns across the floor. It felt surreal, like a dream, or a nightmare she couldn't wake from. But Sophie wasn't afraid, not anymore. The fear of the unknown had taken root inside her long ago, but it was nothing compared to the fear of remaining in the dark. She had to know what her uncle had been hiding. The crowbar was heavier than she expected, and her hands shook as she wedged it between the rotting floorboards. With a grunt she pulled, the sound of splintering wood filling the empty space. The boards creaked in protest, but they gave way. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she peeled them back, her eyes widening at the sight below. There, beneath the altar, was a small metal hatch, rusted and old, but unmistakably a door to something hidden, something long forgotten. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. It was almost too much to take in. What could be hidden here, under the altar of a church? She didn't know what she expected. Maybe an old box, maybe more ledgers, or maybe just an empty void. But as she pried the hatch open with the crowbar, she felt her hands tremble. Inside, shrouded in the darkness, was a safe. A heavy, ancient safe that looked out of place, as if it had been left there on purpose, meant to stay hidden forever. The metal was cold to the touch, and the rust on the edges hinted at just how long it had been there. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had to blink a few times, disbelief clouding her mind. A safe? What was this? Her uncle had never mentioned anything about a safe. There had never been any hint of such a thing, but here it was, staring her in the face. Her heart raced as she knelt closer, inspecting it. The lock was old, but it looked sturdy. There was no obvious way to open it, no combination or key in sight. She ran her hand over the surface, feeling the weight of it, feeling the gravity of what it could contain. She had to know what was inside. Sophie could feel it. This was the moment that everything would change. This was what she had been looking for. But what if it was dangerous? What if she wasn't supposed to know? The doubts crept in again, but Sophie pushed them away. She wasn't going to turn back now, not after everything she'd discovered, not after all the secrets she had uncovered. This safe was her only chance at the truth. Her hands trembled as she stood up, scanning the room for something that could help her break the lock. The crowbar wouldn't work, not on a safe this old and solid. She needed something more. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as she searched through the debris and old furniture scattered around the church. Finally, she spotted a rusted wrench, half buried beneath a pile of broken wood. She grabbed it and, with trembling hands, returned to the safe. Sophie's heart raced as she tried to pry open the lock with the wrench. The metal screeched and groaned under the pressure, but it didn't give way. She could feel the sweat collecting at the back of her neck, the sound of her breath echoing in the silence of the church. Every instinct told her to stop, to leave this place and forget everything. But another part of her, a part she couldn't deny, urged her forward. She needed to see what was inside. With a final pull, the lock gave way, and the safe creaked open. Sophie's hands flew to her mouth as she stared inside, her breath coming in short bursts. The contents were a jumble of papers, old photographs, and something else, something shiny. She reached inside, fingers trembling, and pulled out a thick bundle of cash, neatly wrapped and sealed with a ribbon. It was more money than Sophie had ever seen in her life, and beneath it more ledgers, more of the same, only this time the names and transactions were even darker, more cryptic. Sophie's mind raced as she pieced it together. Her uncle had been hiding this. He had kept it here, beneath the altar, for a reason. But why? What was he involved in? And why had he left it for her to find? The weight of the discovery settled over her, and for the first time Sophie realized that she was no longer just the inheritor of a broken church. She was part of something far bigger, and it was only just beginning to unfold. Sophie sat on the cold church floor, her back against the altar, the safe open in front of her. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the only sound was the faint hum of the storm outside, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. The hours had stretched on longer than she'd expected. She'd tried everything, pressing, pulling, turning the dial, muttering to herself as the numbers swirled in her mind. It felt like she was chasing shadows, each failed attempt pushing her deeper into a pit of uncertainty. But just as her patience was about to break, she heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. Her heart skipped in her chest. She had done it. She had finally opened the safe. Her hands shook as she pulled open the door, revealing its contents. The sight made her stomach lurch. Neatly stacked leather-bound boxes filled the safe, their edges worn, the color faded with age. Sophie felt a wave of disbelief rush over her as she reached inside, her fingers brushing against the boxes. She carefully pulled one out, its weight surprising her. Inside, wrapped tightly in twine, were bundles of cash, thick, crisp stacks of bills. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she lifted the first bundle, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The money had the unmistakable feel of fresh, uncirculated bills, but there was something about them that felt wrong. The smell of old leather, mixed with the faint scent of ink from the printed bills, made her head spin. She laid the stack of cash down gently on the floor and peeled back the ribbon, revealing a number of tightly wrapped bundles beneath. She carefully counted the first stack, $20,000, maybe more. Her pulse quickened. There was so much money, far more than she had ever seen in her life. How could this be here, in a small church, hidden away beneath the altar where no one had set foot in years? The logical part of her brain screamed that it didn't make sense. This wasn't the kind of thing her uncle, a preacher, would have had access to. This kind of cash was beyond anything she could ever have imagined. Sophie swallowed hard, her mind racing with a dozen different thoughts. Was this part of his ministry? Was it for some greater good, some secret cause he had been hiding from everyone? She thought back to the rumors Mary and Tim had shared with her, the whispered stories about her uncle's strange behavior, and the money that seemed to flow through the church's doors, but never in any official records. Was this it? Had he been hiding it, keeping it secret from everyone, convinced it was for a higher purpose? The more Sophie tried to convince herself that this money had a noble purpose, the more unsettled she felt. No, this wasn't just money for a mission or a cause. This was something else entirely. There was no logical explanation for why this kind of money was hidden away in the church, not unless her uncle had been involved in something far darker than she was willing to admit. She stared at the stacks of cash, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear. This money wasn't meant to be found. It wasn't meant for anyone to see, least of all her. It was tucked away for a reason, buried under the altar like a secret too dangerous to expose. Her mind raced through the possibilities, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was her uncle involved in something illegal? Some kind of underground operation? Was the church a front for something much bigger than she had ever imagined? The thought made her stomach churn. Sophie had never considered her uncle capable of anything like this. He had always seemed like a quiet, isolated man, focused on his ministry and his faith. But the evidence in front of her told a different story. If this money wasn't for charity or a cause, then what was it for? She let out a shaky breath, her fingers trembling as she reached for another bundle. This was bigger than she could have ever anticipated, and the reality of it was starting to set in. Her uncle's death, the church's abandonment, everything she had inherited, it was all leading her to this, a dangerous, hidden truth. Sophie wasn't sure what to do with it. The money wasn't hers to take, but it wasn't hers to leave either. She had uncovered this secret, this dark part of her uncle's life, and now it felt like it was hers to solve. She looked around the church, the dust mote swirling in the dim light. It felt like the walls were closing in on her. Sophie realized she had a choice. She could walk away, turn her back on this place, sell it, and forget about everything. Or she could dig deeper, keep searching for the answers her uncle had left behind, even if those answers were dangerous. The decision felt like a weight on her shoulders, but there was no easy way out. Sophie stared at the money one last time, a cold sense of clarity settling over her. This was her uncle's legacy, for better or worse, and she had inherited it all. The church, the mystery, the secrets. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to uncover the truth, but there was no turning back now. As she carefully placed the bundles back inside the safe, Sophie knew that what came next could change everything, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what she would find. Sophie stood in the dim light of the church, her hands trembling as they clutched the bundles of cash. It was surreal. She could still feel the cold weight of the money in her palms, each bill pressed tightly together like a secret too heavy to bear. The safe was still open in front of her, the last bundle of cash neatly stacked, its ribbons tied tight, waiting for her next move. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to process everything that had just unfolded. The money was here, buried under the altar, hidden for who knew how long, and now it was hers to deal with. She could hear the voices in her head, each one pushing her in a different direction. One voice told her to call the authorities. This was stolen money, wasn't it? This wasn't her cash to keep. It wasn't hers to take. The other voice, the one that had started to grow louder and louder as the hours passed, told her to take the money to the bank. It could solve everything. She could fix the church, pay her bills, get her life back on track. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, and it could change everything for her kids. But then the doubt crept in. What if this money was tied to something worse? What if it was illegal, part of something her uncle had been involved in that was far darker than she could ever have imagined? Sophie knew better than to just take the money and walk away. She wasn't a criminal. She didn't want to become one. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she didn't have much choice. The church was falling apart, her bills were piling up, and she had no other way to fix things. The money had come to her, it had found its way into her hands, and maybe it was meant for something good, something right. She looked around the church, her gaze landing on the crumbling pews, the broken windows. The place was a wreck. It felt like an albatross around her neck. Every time she thought about the church, she thought about the weight of it, the work it needed to be saved, the burden she had inherited. This money could change everything. She could fix the church, keep her kids in school, get them out of that crumbling apartment. She could breathe again. But the more she thought about it, the more the doubts came. What if this was tied to something sinister? What if her uncle had been involved in something far beyond his ministry, something dangerous? She couldn't ignore the fact that the money had been hidden here, in a place so sacred it was almost as if her uncle had been trying to protect it from the world. Maybe he hadn't wanted her to find it. Maybe she wasn't supposed to. Sophie exhaled slowly, trying to steady her thoughts. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. She couldn't make this decision alone. She needed help. She needed someone she could trust, someone who could guide her through this. Her mind immediately went to Tom, the local lawyer, an old friend who had always been reliable, steady. He had helped her with the small things over the years, with legal papers and advice, but this was different. This was bigger than anything she had ever dealt with. Tom had always been pragmatic, level-headed, the kind of person who could see things clearly when she couldn't. He'd known her uncle years ago, back when he was still involved in the community, and maybe he could help her piece together what her uncle had been up to. Maybe he could explain the money, or at the very least, help her decide what to do next. She knew it wasn't wise to keep this secret for much longer. Sophie had never been one to ignore her moral compass, but the practical side of her, the side that had kept her going through the toughest times, told her that the money was a lifeline. But at what cost? Sophie glanced down at the bundles of cash again, the weight of them still heavy in her hands. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something, staring into an abyss she couldn't understand. If she kept the money, what would happen? If she reported it, would she be putting herself in danger? Would the authorities find out something she wasn't ready to face? She had no answers, only more questions, but the one thing she was sure of was that she couldn't make this decision alone. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Tom's number. The phone rang once, then twice. She felt her stomach tighten, and for a moment she considered hanging up. Maybe it would be better to deal with this on her own, but before she could disconnect the call, Tom's voice came through the line. "Hey, Sophie, what's going on?" His voice was calm, steady as always. Sophie took a deep breath, glancing at the safe once more. "I need your help," she said quietly. "It's about the church. And something I found." Tom was silent for a moment, then responded with a softness that made Sophie feel like he already knew there was more to the story. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice full of assurance. "We'll figure this out." Sophie felt a small hesitant relief wash over her. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in days, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this. The money, the secrets, the church, it all felt too much to bear. But with Tom's help, maybe she could finally make sense of it. Tom's office smelled faintly of old books and coffee, a comforting mix of familiarity and professionalism. Sophie sat across from him, her hands clenched tightly around her purse, trying to steady the rapid beat of her heart. She had been nervous before calling him, but now that he was here, listening to her, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He was calm, composed, just the way he always was. Tom was someone Sophie trusted, someone who had always been there for her when she needed guidance, but this was different. This was too much for her to carry alone. Tom sat back in his chair, nodding slowly as Sophie explained the situation. She told him about the condition of the church, the years of neglect, the broken windows and decaying pews. She described the ledger she'd found, the strange transactions, the names that didn't make sense, and then she told him about the safe, the money she had discovered hidden under the altar. Sophie's voice trembled as she spoke, but Tom didn't interrupt. He just listened, his brow furrowed, processing everything she said. When she finished, he leaned forward, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "This is a lot, Sophie. A hell of a lot more than I was expecting." His voice was steady, but there was a hint of concern behind his words. Sophie could see the gears turning in his head, the wheels of his logical mind trying to make sense of the chaos she had dropped in his lap. He looked at her, his eyes searching for answers, but Sophie could see that he didn't have them either. "I had no idea," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. I found it, and now I don't know what to do with it." Tom leaned back, crossing his arms as he looked down at the desk, considering his next words carefully. "First things first," he said slowly. "You have to be careful. The money you found could be tied to something far worse than you realize. This isn't just about the church or your uncle's past. It's about what's happening now and what this could mean for you, For your family." Sophie swallowed hard. "I know. That's what I'm afraid of. I don't want to make things worse. I don't know who to trust, what to do next. I thought about taking it to the bank, but I don't want to end up in some kind of mess I can't get out of." She paused, her eyes pleading. "Tom, I don't want to be in over my head." Tom studied her for a moment, his gaze softening as he took in her desperation. "I get it, Sophie. This is a huge mess, but we need to take it step by step. You've got to make sure the money's legitimate first. Don't do anything until we know where it came from." Sophie nodded, though the thought of waiting felt like a weight on her chest. She had come so far in her search for answers, and now it felt like she was back at square one. "How do we even figure that out?" she asked, her voice low with uncertainty. "How do we trace it?" Tom leaned forward again, picking up a pen and tapping it against the desk, his eyes sharp and focused. "We get the money appraised. You can take it to a financial expert or an appraiser who specializes in large sums like this. They'll be able to tell us more about the bills themselves, if they're clean, if they're new, if they've been circulated through the bank system, or if they're older, marked as untraceable." Sophie's stomach churned at the thought. She had always been a practical woman, someone who liked to know where she stood, but this was all uncharted territory. Everything she knew, her job, her family's future, it all seemed so far away from this moment, like she was being pulled into a dark whirlpool she couldn't escape. "I'll help you with that," Tom continued, his tone gentle but firm. "Once we know more about the money, we can figure out the next steps. But you need to understand this. Whatever we find, it could open up a whole can of worms. If your uncle was involved in something illegal, if this money's tied to a criminal operation, you could be in danger just by having it." Sophie felt the gravity of his words sink into her bones. The thought of danger, of being connected to something dangerous, terrified her. But what choice did she have? She couldn't walk away now, not after everything she had already uncovered. She wasn't going to let this ruin her life, but she wasn't going to sit back and let it ruin her family's future either. "I know," Sophie said quietly, meeting Tom's eyes. "But if I don't do this, if I don't figure out what's going on, I'll never be able to move on. I'll be stuck wondering what's out there, what I missed. I have to know the truth, Tom." Tom nodded slowly, his gaze softening with understanding. "You're right. And I'll help you. But you need to promise me something, Sophie." "What?" she asked, her voice tight. "That you won't make any rash decisions. We do this right. We do this carefully. One step at a time." Sophie nodded, though the unease in her chest didn't quite go away. "I promise," she whispered. As they sat in the quiet of the office, the weight of the situation pressed down on Sophie. Every step she took from here on out could change everything. The future she had worked so hard to build for her family, the safety she had always provided for her children. It was all hanging in the balance now. She had no idea where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't turn back. The rain had stopped by the time Sophie arrived at Tom's office to meet Sarah, the private investigator. She hadn't known what to expect when Tom had suggested hiring someone to help trace the origins of the money, but Sarah's no-nonsense attitude was immediately clear as soon as she walked in. She was tall, with dark hair tied back into a tight ponytail and a stern look that could freeze the most persistent of questions. When she shook Sophie's hand, it was firm, calculated, like she had already decided everything about Sophie before they'd even exchanged a word. After a brief introduction, they went straight to work. Sarah asked Sophie to explain the situation from the beginning. Sophie recounted the details of the church, the discovery of the ledger, the shocking amount of money hidden beneath the altar, and the unsettling feeling that had taken root in her chest. She explained the strange transactions, the names she didn't recognize, the nagging doubt that her uncle had been involved in something much darker than anyone had imagined. Throughout it all, Sarah's expression remained impassive, her eyes focused, as if she were already piecing together the puzzle. Once Sophie had finished, Sarah nodded slowly, pulling out a small notebook and flipping it open. "I'll need access to the ledger and any documents you have about the church. Anything that can give me a starting point." Sophie handed her the ledger, still marked with the faint scent of old paper, and Sarah scanned the pages quickly. She made a few notes, then looked up at Sophie. "Don't worry. I've handled worse." Her voice was steady, but Sophie could sense the weight behind the words. It was as if Sarah was warning her that she was about to enter a world far beyond what she had ever imagined. Days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Sophie tried to carry on with her life, but her mind constantly returned to the church and the money. She had 1,000 questions, but no answers. Sarah had asked for a week to trace the money, dig into the names in the ledger, and follow any leads that might give them a sense of where this money came from. Sophie did her best to keep it together, but the thought of her uncle's secrets consuming her day by day made everything feel like it was slipping through her fingers. Then, one afternoon, Sophie received the call she'd been dreading. "Meet me at the office," Sarah said. Her voice was businesslike, but there was an edge to it, something that made Sophie's stomach drop. "I have the report." Sophie didn't hesitate. She drove straight to Sarah's office, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When she arrived, Sarah was waiting for her at the desk, a thick manila folder in front of her. She motioned for Sophie to sit, then slid the folder across the table. Sophie's hands shook as she opened it, her heart pounding. She started reading the first page, but as her eyes moved down the list of names, her breath caught in her throat. She knew some of these names, wealthy figures who donated to the church, patrons of the community who were involved in local charities. But others were darker, names that Sophie had only heard whispered about in the background. Names tied to organized crime, men with reputations so sinister that even the mention of their names sent chills down her spine. The report detailed the ways these men had funneled money through businesses in the area, but what stopped Sophie cold was the mention of her uncle's name and how he had been listed as a key intermediary in these transactions. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her uncle, the man who had always appeared so devoted to his faith, had been involved in something so much worse than she could have imagined. He wasn't just running a small, struggling church. He had been acting as a middleman in a network of criminals, laundering money and hiding it in plain sight. Sophie's mind raced, trying to reconcile this with the image she had of him, the quiet preacher who had stayed isolated from the town, hiding in the shadows. She had never known this man. The man in these reports wasn't the uncle she remembered. He was someone else entirely. Her hands trembled as she turned the page, trying to absorb the next part of the report. There were photographs of meetings, taken from a distance, with men she didn't recognize. But one face stood out, one that Sophie immediately knew. C. D. Montgomery, the name she had seen in the ledger. The same name associated with the last deposit her uncle had made. He was a known figure in the local underground scene, someone with ties to powerful criminals. But Sophie hadn't expected to see him here, tied to her uncle's actions in ways she hadn't fully understood. Sophie set the report down, her heart pounding in her chest. Her uncle had been a part of something dangerous, something sinister, and now she was tied to it too. The money, the church, the secrecy. It was all connected in ways that were far beyond what she could have imagined. She had always known that there were cracks in the world around her, but this was something entirely different. Her uncle had been protecting her from this, keeping her away from the darkness that had consumed him. The thought sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. Had he known what he was getting into? Had he hidden this from her to protect her? Or had he simply been too far gone, wrapped up in a world that she couldn't understand? Sophie didn't know. All she knew was that she couldn't walk away from this now. The truth had been buried beneath the altar, and now it was up to her to decide what to do with it. Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. "This is bigger than just a church, Sophie. We need to decide what to do before someone else makes that decision for us." Sophie couldn't shake the image of the money, its crisp, thick bundles still hidden away in the back of her closet, tucked beneath layers of old linens. Every time she closed her eyes, the sight of those stacks was there, staring back at her, daring her to make a decision. The weight of it pressed down on her, heavier than any burden she'd ever carried. She knew she couldn't keep it forever, but returning it wasn't an option either. The money was tied to something darker, something her uncle had kept hidden for so long. The thought that she was now tangled in his secrets made her stomach twist. She was standing on the edge of something, but every step forward felt like it would plunge her into a world she wasn't prepared to face. Sophie had spent her life trying to protect her children, to give them the kind of stability she never had growing up. The church, this inheritance, had promised something she never expected, a chance to fix everything, to make things right. But the longer she thought about it, the more she realized that the legacy her uncle had left her was a dangerous one. There was no way out of this mess without consequences. The phone rang that afternoon, and Sophie didn't even have time to brace herself for what was coming. She saw the number on the screen, an unrecognized private number, and her heart skipped a beat. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but the words made her blood run cold. "You found it, didn't you?" the voice said. Sophie's throat tightened, and she felt the ground beneath her shift. "The money," the voice continued, "and the secrets. We know. You need to return what you've found, now." Sophie's pulse raced as she pressed the phone to her ear, trying to steady her breath. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaky, though she couldn't mask the fear creeping into it. There was a pause, and then a soft laugh, almost too quiet to hear. "Doesn't matter who we are. What matters is what you do next. You have something that isn't yours, Sophie, something that could ruin everything if it gets out. Return it, or there will be consequences." The line went dead. Sophie stood frozen, the phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The message had been clear, chilling in its simplicity. Someone knew about the money. Someone knew what she had found, and they were watching her. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she stopped herself. What if this wasn't just about the money? What if this was bigger than her, bigger than the church, than everything she thought she understood? She thought back to the investigation Sarah had done, the dark web of connections that tied her uncle to people far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Organized crime, shady figures, people with power who could destroy her life in a heartbeat. Sophie wasn't sure if calling the authorities would help or make things worse. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. The walls of the small church seemed to close in on her. She could almost feel the weight of her uncle's legacy pressing against her chest. The money, the secrets, they had never been meant for her. They had never been a gift, no matter how much she tried to rationalize it. They were a trap. Her uncle had hidden them away, and now they were hers, by default, whether she wanted them or not. And that was the problem. Sophie was tangled in a web she didn't know how to untangle. What did she do now? She could leave the money, walk away from this twisted inheritance, and try to pick up the pieces of her life. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't just pretend this didn't exist. This wasn't just about the money, it was about the dangers she had unknowingly stepped into, the risks to her family, the darkness that had followed her uncle all these years and now had latched itself onto her. Her heart sank as she thought of Jack and Emma. They had no idea what she was dealing with, no idea what had been uncovered in the church beneath the altar. They were safe now, but how long would that last? Could she keep them safe while she played this game with people who didn't care about anyone but themselves? Sophie's protective instincts kicked in. She couldn't let this drag her children into the mess her uncle had created. She had to fix this. Sophie stood up, her mind racing. The money had to be returned, but how? And to whom? The threats were real, and now that she was involved, she couldn't pretend she could walk away unscathed. She had no idea how deep this went, or how far these people would go to get what they wanted. One thing was certain, she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, but she didn't know who to trust. Tom had been the first person she reached out to, but he couldn't protect her from the kind of danger she was facing. Maybe it was time to go further, to confront the people behind the threats, take them on head on, and make them understand that she wasn't going to let them control her or her family. But that, too, came with its own risks. Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready for what that might entail. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and Sophie realized she was standing at a crossroads. Every choice she made from here on out would change everything. She wasn't sure where this road would lead, but she knew one thing: there was no turning back now. The night air was cold, crisp against Sophie's skin as she walked back to the church, the streetlights casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The church loomed ahead, its broken windows and sagging roof a constant reminder of everything she had inherited, everything she was trying to fix. But as much as she tried to focus on the task at hand, her mind kept drifting back to the phone call, the threatening voice that had left her with more questions than answers. The weight of it all was suffocating, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. As she neared the church, the sound of tires screeching on the wet pavement caught her off guard. She turned just in time to see a dark car speeding toward her, headlights blinding her for a split second. It swerved dangerously close, the engine roaring, and just before it passed, the window rolled down. A voice, low, menacing, shouted at her from the car, "Return it or you'll regret it." The words hung in the air, sharp and threatening, as the car sped off into the night, disappearing around the corner. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest as the adrenaline surged. She stood frozen, staring at the empty street where the car had been, the echo of the warning still ringing in her ears. For a moment, Sophie didn't know what to do. Her legs felt weak, as though the weight of the night had suddenly become too much to bear. She had always known this was dangerous, the money, the secrets, the people she was dealing with, but hearing the threat so directly, so close, made it all too real. She hadn't realized until that moment just how deep she was in, how far the darkness had already crept into her life. The rest of the walk to the church was a blur. Her steps quickened as she reached the front door, the familiar feeling of security momentarily settling over her. But as soon as she locked the door behind her, the fear returned, creeping up her spine like a cold chill. She couldn't shake the image of the car, the threatening words. It was the first real sign that they were watching her, that someone was tracking her every move. The next morning, the dread in Sophie's chest hadn't faded. She knew something was wrong. When she stepped outside to go to her car, her heart dropped. Both tires on the driver's side were slashed, the deep gashes in the rubber making the car completely unusable. The sight hit her like a punch to the gut, and she staggered back, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She dialed Tom immediately, but the words barely came out as she explained what had happened. Tom was quiet for a moment, and Sophie could hear the concern in his voice when he spoke. "You need to go to the police, Sophie. This is no longer something you can handle on your own. This is serious." But even as he said the words, Sophie's gut twisted. She couldn't go to the police. She had no idea who was behind the threats, and she couldn't risk exposing herself or the money to someone who might not be on her side. The idea of being thrown into a system she couldn't trust, with the weight of everything hanging over her, was too much. The threats were personal, too personal. Whoever was doing this wasn't just after the money. They were after her, after everything she had left. "I can't, Tom," she said, her voice tight with panic. "I don't know who to trust anymore. This is bigger than I thought. I'm too far in, and if I go to the police, I don't know what will happen. I can't risk it." Her voice broke at the end, the realization hitting her hard. She was in deeper than she had ever imagined, and she didn't know how to climb back out. Tom sighed, his voice softer now. "I understand, but you need to protect yourself. I don't want you to do something you'll regret." Sophie hung up, the weight of his words sinking in. She stood in the driveway, looking at the ruined tires, feeling the eyes of the world, or at least the eyes of whoever was after her, on her. The pressure was unbearable. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but that night the fear settled in again. Sophie had never been the paranoid type. She had always been strong, pragmatic, focused on the next task, the next thing Mom to fix. But now, as she locked up the church again, checking every door and window with a meticulousness she hadn't used before, she realized how much things had changed. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like an omen, a reminder that she was being watched. The walls of the church, once just a physical space, now felt like they were closing in on her, trapping her in a world she couldn't escape. She sat at the desk, her hands clenched in her lap, staring out at the darkened street. The church was silent, but the silence was deafening. Sophie didn't know how long she could keep this up, how long she could keep hiding in the shadows of her own fear. The money, the church, the secrets, they were too much to handle on her own. But if she asked for help, if she reached out to the wrong person, would she end up trapped even deeper in the mess her uncle had left behind? The question gnawed at her, and as she glanced at the locked door, the thought crossed her mind again. Was it worth it? Was the price of knowing the truth worth the danger that was now so close? It felt like it was breathing down her neck. The answer, Sophie realized, was no longer simple. Every step she took felt like it could be the last step toward freedom or the first step toward something darker than she could imagine. Sophie hadn't been able to sleep. The weight of the day, of everything that had happened, the threats, the vandalized car, the sense of being watched, had kept her awake, turning the church into a suffocating cage. She was trapped, and with each passing minute, the walls seemed to close in a little tighter. The threat felt like it was everywhere, lingering just beyond the shadows, in every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the broken windows. Her uncle's secret, once something she could distance herself from, was now a living thing, breathing down her neck. But as she sat in the dim light of the church that evening, her fingers tracing the edge of the ledger for the 100th time, a knock at the door made her heart jump. It was too late for visitors. Sophie hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The fear returned, rising up in a wave, but she pushed it down, standing slowly, her steps echoing in the hollow silence as she walked to the door. She peered through the crack in the door, not sure what she was expecting, but certainly not the man standing there. James was a face she hadn't seen in years, and at first she didn't recognize him. He looked older now, his face weathered but familiar, a bit graying at the temples. Sophie's pulse quickened as she remembered his name, James, an old friend of her uncle's. He had always been a quiet, reserved man, someone who had come and gone from the church in the background, never in the spotlight, but always present. She had forgotten about him, tucked him away in the corners of her memory, but now, seeing him on her doorstep, something stirred in her gut. "James?" she asked cautiously, her voice low. He nodded, his eyes scanning the church behind her. "I'm sorry to intrude this late, but we need to talk." Sophie stepped back, uncertain but desperate for any information that could help. She hadn't expected to have any allies, especially not from someone who had known her uncle. But now, with the danger closing in, she realized she might not have a choice. She opened the door wider, allowing him in. As he stepped over the threshold, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was letting in more than just an old friend. Once inside, James didn't waste time. He glanced around the church, his face unreadable, then turned to Sophie. "Your uncle left you a mess, didn't he?" Sophie nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. I found the money, and the ledger, but I don't understand. I don't know what it all means." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of it all finally catching up with her. "James, I need to know what's going on. What did he do?" James took a breath, and for the first time Sophie saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked nervously toward the door. "I don't know how much your uncle told you, But he was involved in something far bigger than anyone around here realized. The church, the money. It wasn't just for faith, Sophie. It was for something else entirely. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? James sighed, sitting down heavily on one of the old pews. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers tapping absently. Your uncle used this place as a sanctuary, a refuge for people who needed to escape from dangerous situations, from people who meant them harm. The money? It wasn't for the church. It was for them, for people who needed to disappear, to start fresh. Your uncle wasn't just running a church. He was helping people get out of dangerous lives, getting them away from people who would have killed them. The money was meant for those escape funds. Sophie listened, her mind racing as the pieces started to fall into place. It made sense, the secretive nature of her uncle, his isolation, his tendency to keep people at arm's length. She had never understood it, but now it seemed so clear. Her uncle had been hiding something much bigger than just an old church. He had been running a secret operation, one that had put him at odds with people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone in their way. But something went wrong, James continued, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Your uncle, he made a deal with the wrong people, and he had to disappear. That's why he left the church to you. He thought you'd be safe. He thought the money would protect you if anything happened. Sophie's stomach tightened. And now that I've found it, what happens now? James met her eyes, his gaze serious. Now you're in their sights. The people your uncle helped, the ones he kept hidden, they're out there, and they won't stop until they get what's theirs. This money? It's not just money. It's the price of their silence, the price of their protection, and now that you've found it, it's on you. Sophie's breath hitched. She had thought the money was her way out, a way to fix everything, but now it felt like a curse, a chain that would drag her deeper into a world of danger she had no business being in. What do I do? She whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. James stood, his posture rigid, his expression softening. You need to move the money. Get it out of here. If you don't, they'll come for you, and they won't stop. But even then, be careful. It's a delicate balance. The people who want it aren't afraid of doing whatever it takes to get it back. You need to protect your family, Sophie. They'll stop at nothing. Sophie felt the weight of his words sink in. She had never imagined her life would spiral into something like this. She had thought the church and its problems were just a nuisance, a burden she had inherited. But now the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. And Sophie realized, with a sinking heart, that whatever had happened to her uncle, she had just become part of it. Sophie sat alone in the quiet of the church, the cold stone walls seeming to close in on her as she wrestled with the decision that had been haunting her for days. The money sat hidden in the back of the church, a secret she could no longer ignore, and the weight of it felt like it was crushing her. She had been walking through a fog of uncertainty, but now everything seemed so clear, too clear. The money was meant to fix everything, to free her from the weight of her crumbling apartment, to secure a future for Jack and Emma, to give them the stability they deserved. But at what cost? The conversation with Tom and James had left her with more questions than answers. They both had different ideas on what she should do, and neither option seemed like one she could walk into with any peace of mind. Tom, ever the voice of reason, had urged her to take the money to the authorities. The right thing to do, he said, is to turn it in, Sophie. You can't carry this weight alone. It's not yours, and it's not worth risking everything for. He'd looked at her, his brow furrowed, as if trying to impart some final sense of security. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that turning it over to the authorities might just make the danger worse. The people her uncle had been hiding from weren't just dangerous, they were ruthless. Would the authorities be able to protect her family? Would they even believe her? Then there was James. He hadn't minced words when he'd spoken. You need to move the money, he'd said, his voice low, urgent. Get it out of here before they come for you. These people, they'll stop at nothing. Your uncle knew that. He was protecting you, even if he didn't tell you everything." The finality in his words had hit her like a punch to the gut. She had never thought she would be in a situation where moving money could mean the difference between life and death. But that was what James was telling her. The money could buy her family safety, but it could also bring them into even more danger. There was no escaping this, no easy way out. Sophie felt the weight of it all. She had always been the one who took care of everything, who kept the pieces together, who kept her family safe. But now, for the first time in her life, she realized she was standing at the edge of a precipice. Every decision, every move she made would have consequences that she couldn't take back. Her family's future, their safety, everything she had worked for, it all rested on what she chose to do with the money. The thought of using it for her family's future seemed like the right thing to do. She could pay off debts, fix the church, even buy a new home for Jack and Emma. They deserved better than the crumbling apartment, the constant stress of bills and repairs. Sophie had spent years trying to make sure her children had everything they needed, trying to be both mother and father, after her ex-husband had walked out. She had sacrificed so much, and now this money could change everything. She could give them the stability they had never known, the chance to start fresh, to escape the weight of their past. But then there was the other side of it, the part of her that knew the money wasn't hers to take. The thought of keeping it, of using it to change their lives, made her stomach twist with guilt. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what it represented. She had no idea what her uncle had been involved in, no idea who the people were who had been helping him or who might come after them. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this money, this hidden secret, wasn't a gift. It was a curse, a dangerous legacy that would change her life forever, no matter which way she chose. Her children deserved stability. Sophie knew that. She had promised herself, time and time again, that she would never let them suffer the way she had. But could she truly protect them if she kept the money? Could she find peace knowing that the very thing that would secure their future could also bring their lives crashing down? She stood up, walking to the altar, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the church. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the church itself was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. Sophie ran her hand along the smooth surface of the altar, the place where her uncle had once preached, where he had hidden everything he thought was worth protecting. She wondered if he had known how dangerous it would be for her to take on this burden. Had he kept the truth from her to protect her, or had he been too far gone, consumed by the world he had chosen to live in? Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest. There was no easy answer, no way to go back. The path ahead was murky, uncertain. And yet one truth remained clear. No matter what she decided, her life, and her family's life, would never be the same. She was already in too deep, tangled in a web of secrets and lies, and now she had to choose how far she was willing to go to protect what was hers. Taking a deep breath, Sophie opened her eyes, looking down at the ledger and the hidden cash beneath the altar. She wasn't sure which way she was going, but one thing was certain. The weight of her decision was only just beginning to show its true cost. Sophie's decision had been made. The weight of the money, the weight of the secret it carried, had gnawed at her for far too long. She couldn't keep it. Not after everything she'd uncovered, not with the danger that seemed to shadow her every move. The thought of returning it had haunted her, and she knew she had to do it. But she couldn't just walk into a bank, drop the money off, and expect everything to go back to normal. The people behind this, the ones who had made it clear they were watching her, would never let it be that simple. Sophie needed to outsmart them, get the money out of her hands, but do it in a way that wouldn't put her family at risk. She contacted James, telling him her plan. It was risky, dangerous even, but it felt like her only option. They agreed on a time. The drop-off would be at the church, the very place where all of this had started. The place where her uncle had hidden his secrets. Sophie had arranged for someone to meet her, someone who would take the money and disappear with it, leaving her free from the weight of it once and for all. James assured her he would help, but as the hours ticked down, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. When the night came, the church stood eerily silent. The street outside was empty, the only sound the occasional rustle of wind through the broken windows. Sophie had parked her car a few blocks away, walking the rest of the way to keep from being followed. Her heart beat loudly in her chest as she approached the old wooden doors of the church, the ones that had creaked open countless times before, but never with this kind of purpose. She was about to return everything, and with it, the nightmare that had been consuming her for weeks. As she stepped inside, the familiar smell of dust and mildew filled her lungs. The church, even in its broken state, still felt like a place of memories, memories that were both comforting and terrifying. She moved quickly, trying to keep the unease at bay. She'd hidden the money in a duffel bag, a simple canvas bag that didn't attract attention, but even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Sophie set the bag down at the altar, her fingers trembling as she prepared to leave. She had arranged for a discreet contact to meet her at the church, someone who would take the money and get it out of the town for good. But as she stood there waiting, a strange feeling settled in her gut. Something wasn't right. She glanced around the church, her instinct screaming that she wasn't alone. The door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang, and Sophie spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. 3 men stood at the entrance, their figures shadowed in the dim light. They moved toward her with purpose, their faces masked with expressions she couldn't read. "You made a mistake, Sophie," one of them said, his voice low and menacing. "You shouldn't have gotten involved. This isn't yours to return." Sophie's pulse quickened as she backed away slowly. The bag, the money, was all that mattered to them. It was never about the church, never about her. It was always about the money and the power it gave them. Before she could react, the second man stepped forward, his hand reaching for the bag on the altar. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, but then, just as quickly, she remembered what James had told her. "If they come for you, don't give up. Don't let them control the situation." The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with anticipation. She needed to think fast, to do something that would give her a chance. Sophie's eyes flicked around the room, her mind racing. She noticed a set of old church bells hanging above the altar, their pulleys visible just below the rafters. A plan began to form. The man reached for the duffel bag, but Sophie reacted in a blur. She grabbed a nearby metal candlestick and swung it toward the bell ropes, knocking them loose. The bells began to shake, their chains rattling as they crashed to the floor. The loud noise reverberated through the church, deafening, throwing the men off guard. For a moment they hesitated, giving Sophie the split second she needed. She dove toward the bag, snatching it up, and in one swift motion she sprinted toward the side exit. The men cursed behind her, their footsteps pounding as they chased her through the dark church, but Sophie was faster. She burst through the side door, and just as she thought she'd gotten away, a strong hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back. But before he could pull her in, she twisted out of his grip and ducked into the shadows of the churchyard, breathing heavily. She could hear them scrambling behind her, but she wasn't stopping now. She had to keep moving. As she ran, she caught sight of a familiar face. James. He had been waiting nearby, hidden in the darkness, and with one quick motion, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward his car. "Get in," he said, urgency in his voice. They didn't have time to explain. Sophie threw herself into the passenger seat, the duffel bag still clutched in her lap. James slammed the door shut and started the car, speeding away from the church. The men were far behind, but Sophie's heart still raced. She had managed to outsmart them, at least for now. As they drove off into the night, Sophie realized something. It wasn't just about keeping things safe. It wasn't just about protecting the money, or even saving herself. It was about fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. Sophie had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally in control. The days following the escape from the church felt like a blur, the weight of the past finally lifting from Sophie's shoulders. The car had roared down the empty streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness as she sped away from the life she had known, the life she was ready to leave behind. The money, the threats, the church, all of it seemed so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Sophie had made her decision, and now she was free. But freedom came with its own price, one she hadn't quite understood until now. Sophie had sold the church. It hadn't been easy, and part of her had been reluctant to let go of the building that had become so much a part of her life. But the decision was clear. The church wasn't hers to fix. It was a symbol of a past she could no longer carry, a weight that had dragged her down for far too long. The money from the sale was enough to wipe out most of her debts, to pay for the repairs on the small house she had found for herself and her children. It was a fresh start, not the one she had imagined, but one she could build on. Sophie kept a small portion of the money, just enough to make sure Jack and Emma were taken care of. They would have what they needed: a stable home, food on the table, and the security Sophie had always promised them. But the rest of it? She had turned it over to those who could handle it. She had no desire to keep it, no desire to be entangled in the secrets it represented. The weight of her uncle's legacy had been more than enough to teach her one thing: money wasn't worth the price of peace. Starting a new job felt like a small victory. It wasn't much, just a receptionist position at a small firm, but it was a start. She could finally breathe again. She could walk into a place each day and leave at the end of the day without the constant pressure of the past hanging over her head. For the first time in years, Sophie wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't worried about the next threat, the next person coming after her. She was free to live her life without fear, and that was a freedom she hadn't known she was missing. The days were long, but they were hers. The routine, the quiet satisfaction of providing for her children, of seeing them happy in their new home, felt like the greatest gift. There was no more hiding, no more secrets to unravel. The nightmare of the past had faded, and in its place was a new beginning, one Sophie had fought for, one she could be proud of. But as the weeks passed, Sophie realized that the true treasure wasn't the money, it wasn't the house or the job or the sense of security that had been so elusive for so long. It was the courage to face the unknown, to walk away from the mess her uncle had left behind and carve out a new path for herself. The lessons he had taught her about love, sacrifice, and family had remained, even in the quiet moments when she thought she might have forgotten them. He had kept her safe in his own way, and now Sophie was doing the same for her children. She was creating a future for them that didn't come with shadows, that didn't come with threats or secrets. Sophie was finally beginning to understand what her uncle had been trying to protect all along. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was the people you loved, the ones you fought for, the ones who made life worth living. The true treasure was the life she could build, the one where her children could grow up without fear, without the weight of the past hanging over them. It was the future she could create with her own hands, without the dark legacy that had threatened to define her. As she sat on the front porch one evening, watching Jack and Emma play in the yard, Sophie felt a quiet sense of peace. The weight of the church was gone. The fear that had clung to her like a second skin had lifted. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a place in the world, a place where she could finally breathe. She was no longer the woman running from the past. She was the woman building a future, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay, that her family, her love, and her courage were the things that truly mattered, not the money, not the past, not the shadows. She had faced the unknown, and she had come out stronger on the other side. Sophie sat in the small kitchen of her new home, a cup of tea cradled between her hands, and watched the steam rise from the mug. The house wasn't much, just a modest two-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the home she had imagined when she'd first set out to give her children a better life, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. The walls weren't cracked here, and the floorboards didn't groan under the weight of a past that had once threatened to swallow her whole. It was just a home, a fresh start, and that was something Sophie hadn't allowed herself to hope for in a long time. Jack and Emma had settled in quickly, making the house their own with the small bits of comfort that they'd carried with them from the old apartment. Jack had set up a little corner for his gaming system, and Emma had already covered the walls of her room with drawings of animals and stars. It was their safe place, and Sophie made it her mission to protect that at all costs. She'd learned a lot over the past few months, about resilience, about strength, about the power of a fresh start. But most importantly, she had learned how to put her family first again, to focus on their happiness without the burden of fear hanging over her. Her new job at the local office was nothing glamorous, but it had given her a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. The work was steady, the pay was enough to cover the bills, and the routine felt like a lifeline. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was hers, and it was building in the right direction. Each small victory, a new paycheck, a positive parent-teacher conference for Emma, an afternoon spent at the park without a care in the world, felt like a testament to how far she had come. They were safe, they were stable, and for the first time in years, Sophie didn't wake up with the constant weight of anxiety pressing down on her chest. Her relationship with Tom had changed too, though in ways she hadn't expected. Their connection had started with a simple phone call, his voice offering her guidance when she felt completely lost. Over time, their conversations had shifted from business to something more personal, a deeper understanding that went beyond just shared history. Sophie never thought she'd be in a place to consider romantic relationships again, not after everything she'd been through. But with Tom, it was different. They hadn't been through the same kind of hardship, but they both understood loss, fear, and the kind of loneliness that came with carrying the weight of a secret for far too long. Their bond was built on mutual respect. Tom never pushed her, never tried to rush her into anything. They had dinner now and then, but there was no pressure. It was comfortable, grounded in the kind of trust that only came from shared experience. Sophie had always believed she was too broken for something new, that the parts of her that had been shattered by her past would never heal enough to let someone else in. But with Tom, she didn't feel broken. She felt understood. There was no judgment, no rush, just a quiet partnership, one that made her realize how much she had to give still, how much she could trust again. They had both been through something life-changing. Sophie with the church, with the money, with the decisions that had shaped her life in ways she couldn't have predicted. And Tom, too, with his own losses, his own battles with what had seemed like the safe, predictable path. It was clear now that even the hardest journeys led to unexpected outcomes, ones that could bring light to dark places. Sophie had thought her life was over when she was handed the church and the legacy her uncle had left behind. She had believed that she was destined to be swallowed by the past, but now, as she watched her children laugh in the backyard and heard the familiar sound of Tom's voice on the other end of the phone, she realized that nothing, not even the darkest of days, had the power to keep her from moving forward. Sophie didn't know where life would take her from here. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, that was okay. She had rebuilt a life with her children, a life that was theirs to shape and protect. And in doing so, she had rediscovered parts of herself that she had long forgotten, the parts that could hope, that could love, and that could trust again. She had learned that sometimes the hardest roads led to the most unexpected places, and that even after all she had been through, the future could still hold the promise of something better. Months had passed since Sophie had walked away from the shadows of the church, and in that time, everything had begun to settle into something resembling normalcy. The weight that had once been so heavy, pulling her in a dozen different directions, had lightened with each passing day. She had taken back control of her life, piece by piece, her hands steady as she rebuilt everything she thought she had lost. Her children were thriving, safe in a new home, away from the constant reminders of her uncle's dark legacy. She had a job, a routine, and most importantly, a peace that had eluded her for so long. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, something inside Sophie knew that one last step remained, one final visit. She hadn't been back to the church since the day she'd sold it, hadn't stepped inside since the night she'd faced the threats and the lies. There had always been a part of her that wondered what was left, whether the building or the past would always have some claim on her. She couldn't explain it, but there was a tug, a feeling that she needed to face it one last time. The church had once been a place of mystery, of secrets too heavy to bear, and now it felt like the last chapter of a book she had been desperate to finish. She parked her car outside, the gravel driveway familiar in its quiet stillness. The sky was gray, clouds hanging low, and the wind rustled through the trees as if the world itself was waiting for her. Sophie had always thought she would walk away from the church and never look back, but now, as she stood in front of it, she felt no fear, no anxiety, only a sense of finality. The church was no longer a symbol of everything she had been running from. It was simply a building, a shell of its former self, just like the life it had once represented. Sophie took a deep breath as she stepped out of the car, the air crisp and cool against her skin. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she made her way toward the front doors, which now hung loosely on their hinges. The once grand structure was worn, the edges of the stone softened by time. The windows, still broken, let in the muted light from outside, and the silence that greeted her as she stepped inside felt both heavy and peaceful, as if the building had finally exhaled after all these years. The echoes of her past were here, but they no longer felt like ghosts. They were just memories now, fading, slipping away. Sophie walked slowly, taking in the space, the emptiness. The pews were gone, the altar bare, the space a hollow version of what it once had been. She remembered the first time she'd walked in here, all those months ago, desperate, unsure of what she had inherited, of what kind of burden she had been given. The secrets had weighed on her then, the sense of danger closing in around her with every creak of the floorboards. But now, as she stood in the same place, all of that felt distant. The fear, the uncertainty, the shadows of the past, they had lost their grip on her. For the first time, Sophie felt a strange kind of peace in the stillness of the church. It was just a building now, a piece of history that no longer had any hold over her. She had been living under the shadow of her uncle's mistakes for far too long, but standing here in the quiet, Sophie realized she no longer needed to look over her shoulder. She had faced the darkest parts of her past, had walked through the fire, and had come out the other side stronger. The money, the secrets, the danger, it was all gone, and with it, the part of her that had been haunted by them. As she turned to leave, Sophie felt the finality of it. There was no more unfinished business, no more questions that needed answering. The church had been a part of her past, but it no longer defined her. She had taken back control of her life, and now she was free. She walked toward her car, the gravel crunching beneath her feet, the weight that had once been so heavy, now completely lifted from her shoulders. The church and all it had represented faded behind her. But the lessons, the ones that had been born out of the darkness, stayed with her. She had learned what it meant to fight for what was right, to protect her family, and to find the courage to face the unknown. And in doing so, Sophie had reclaimed something that couldn't be bought or sold, her peace. As she drove away, the church shrinking in her rearview mirror, she realized that the journey she had taken wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about finding herself again, about rebuilding what mattered most. Sophie was no longer the woman who had inherited her uncle's burdens. She was the woman who had faced them, who had let go, and who was finally, truly free. Sophie sat at the head of the dinner table, watching her children squabble over the last slice of pizza. Jack, as always, insisted that Emma had already had more than her fair share, while Emma, eyes wide and defiant, argued that Jack always took the biggest pieces. The sound of their bickering, the warmth of their laughter, filled the room in a way that felt new, fresh, and comforting. Sophie had never imagined that the chaos of a simple family dinner could bring so much peace, but in that moment, it did. She leaned back in her chair, watching them with a smile, though she wasn't entirely present in their silly argument. Her mind drifted, as it often did these days, to the journey that had brought them here, to the life they had now, so far removed from the uncertainty and fear that had clouded their every move not too long ago. They were safe. Sophie knew that deep down. Their future was secure, the danger from the past no longer hanging over them, and for the first time in years, Sophie felt like she could take a deep breath and truly exhale. Her children were happy. They had everything they needed, everything they deserved. The small house they now called home was more than just walls and a roof. It was a symbol of how far they had come, of how much Sophie had fought to give them something better, something different from the past she had left behind. She didn't need a grand house or extravagant things. All she needed was this: a simple life, a secure future, and the love that surrounded her every day. As Jack and Emma continued to argue, Sophie let her gaze soften, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She didn't need to say anything to them. The laughter, the squabbling over something as insignificant as a slice of pizza, it was enough. It was more than enough. They had found their rhythm, their new normal, and it was a beautiful thing to witness. Sophie had learned over the years to appreciate these small, fleeting moments, the ones that felt like a gift even when they seemed so ordinary. She had come a long way since the day she'd first stepped into the church, the day she'd discovered the ledger, the day her life had been thrown into a world of secrets, danger, and fear. She had faced a past that had nearly consumed her, a legacy that threatened to swallow everything she loved. But Sophie had risen. She had fought for her family, for her future, and now, with her children sitting at the table, their faces lit by the warm glow of the kitchen light, Sophie realized something that had become clear over time. The legacy her uncle had left her wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the church or the dangerous world he had been a part of. The real legacy was in the strength to survive, to rebuild, and to rise from even the darkest of circumstances. It was the ability to protect her family, to shield them from the things that had tried to tear her apart. The real inheritance was the wisdom to always stand tall, to face the world without fear, even when the weight of the past seemed too much to carry. And as she watched Jack and Emma continue their playful argument, Sophie realized that the true treasure wasn't the money she had once feared would define her life. It was the love they shared, the bond they had built, and the future they were now creating together. Sophie had spent so many years looking for something, searching for answers, for stability, for peace. But in the end she realized it had always been within her reach, the strength to move forward, to rebuild, and to create a life that was truly her own. The money she had once believed could change everything had been just a distraction, a dangerous weight that had almost torn her apart. But now, with her children laughing at the table and the quiet hum of normal life filling the room, Sophie knew that what mattered most had always been right in front of her: her family, their love, and the peace they had finally found together. That was the true legacy. If this story resonated with you, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe in stories about strength, survival, and new beginnings, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next chapter. Thank you for being here, and remember, sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations.